is a great day to be alive, and I am so thankful for God, Jesus Christ, who lives in us. In today's video titled Reviewing Dates, What Actually Happened? Tariffs, Trade War, U.S. in War. And before I get started, I am not a financial advisor. Nothing that I'm sharing is financial advice. I am simply sharing dreams, visions, and interpretations that I feel God has given me as it relates to crypto. Now, let's get into the video. So here's the video where I shared 3 sets of dates. The first set of dates had to do with news relating to tariffs, small trade war, and any news about war as it relates to the U.S. directly. The second set had to do with XRP news, and the third set has to do, which is in April, up with the wealth transfer and market crash. For each section of dates, there are videos to correspond with the date ranges that I have provided, with the question of, should we expect this to happen on this particular date? Now, for the first set, of course, we're still in February. We're looking at January 25th through February the 14th, with a major focus on February the 14th. In other words, as far as I could understand, as far as the dates that were derived, February 14th was a date that popped out from within this January 25th to February 14th range. And for this reason, I'm praying about it. I'm asking God, well, Lord, should we expect news about tariffs and small trade wars and war as it relates to the U.S. being involved directly? And these topics about tariffs and trade war and the U.S. being directly involved in a war, these questions were derived from 2 dreams that I had back in June in 2024. And based on where God was leading me as far as understanding and interpreting these dreams, which I didn't interpret all at one time, it just kind of came over a course of months. And the question that I asked God was, okay, Lord, are these dreams, both of these dreams together, are they depicting something to do with a trade war and tariffs and the U.S. being involved? Does it have something to do with a small physical war that the U.S. will be involved in? Or are you showing me both? And so jumping right into it, we began to hear a lot of talk about tariffs starting in February. And so here we have the news starting off February 1st. We're hearing the announcement about a 25% tariff that will put on Mexico, China, and Canada. Well, we know that each retaliated with a tariff of their own to put towards the U.S. However, Mexico and Canada came to certain terms that allowed the president to delay their tariffs for 30 days. However, China did not fold. China said, okay, we can take your tariffs. This reminded me of 2 things. Thing number 1 was at the end of a previous video that I did, as I talked about the yellow and red. One of the questions that I put in towards the end of that video, or on the last slide of that video, was, could it be China and tariffs because of the yellow and red? Of course, if you've been following my videos, you know that this color scheme of red and yellow is very significant. The topic on that particular slide had to do with the EU and the collapse of the Germany coalition. Again, out of all 3, Mexico, Canada, and China, China was the only one that did not fold. And so, looking at China's flag, what colors do we see? Yellow and red. So I was not surprised when I heard the news that the other 2 had come up with some kind of agreement to get their tariffs pushed back, whereas China did not. And later on, we heard some things as it relates to Canada and Mexico and how these tariffs would cause risk of inflation due to, or on top of, the already housing crisis that we have here in the U.S. These 25% tariff, when it kicks in towards Mexico and towards Canada, it's been pointed out that there are going to be lots of issues when it comes down to things relating to home construction and materials, because we get a lot of that stuff from Mexico and Canada. And based on this article, we see that Trump has already warned about this. There will be some give and take with as a result of these tariffs. Along the same lines of tariffs inflating the housing crisis here in the U.S., I shared in another video a dream about 2 bears, and one bear correlating with the housing market crash, another bear correlating with the auto market. And I shared some numbers and things as to what comes from Mexico, China, and Canada. And we see that Mexico and Canada are leading as far as where we get the most as far as the cars go and the auto parts. And now I've come to learn that a lot as far as housing and construction also comes from Mexico and China. And so you would have to go back and look at that video in order to get the full details of that dream and how I put all that together. Moving forward, February the 9th, we're looking at the Super Bowl. And during the Super Bowl, we get the commercial that has to do with Canada. And not a coincidence that after the Super Bowl, the next day, it was announced that there would be a 25% aluminum and steel tariffs that would be put on everybody, and no one will be exempt from it. So I don't know. Some people are saying that this is a hit to Canada simply because of the commercial that they showed during the Super Bowl. I'm not sure if that was already always in the plans. Who knows? Following that, we get more news about reciprocal tariffs. And I believe that was on the 13th of February. And before we get to the 14th of February, I want to step back to the Super Bowl because I saw an article that talked about this individual who somehow snuck his way in during halftime, and he held up this particular flag as represents Gaza, I guess, protesting. So this leads us right into a conflict that took place during this time with Hamas saying that they were not going to let hostages go simply because they feel like Israel had done XYZ. And then Trump comes back and he responds to their threat with a response of his own. After reading Trump's response, it reminded me of the two questions that I asked. Is this possibly us seeing the U.S. getting involved, possibly physically getting involved with this Israel-Hamas war? When he made this statement about the hostages not being released by 12 p.m. on Saturday, when he put this message out, what did he exactly mean as far as the U.S. involvement in all of this? But the biggest thing that I thought about was my Netanyahu single gunshot dream. And I shared that in that dream, I heard a single gunshot and I saw shattered glass and everyone hit the ground, even Netanyahu. He was doing an interview. Hearing that single gunshot to me represents the opposite of a ceasefire because you hear a gunshot. And then seeing the cracked glass represents the cracking or breaking of the ceasefire agreement. In the dream, I saw blood on the top of Netanyahu's head as he stood up looking terrified. I wasn't sure if he was terrified simply because he had gotten shot or if he was scared by what had just actually happened. Understanding that the ceasefire agreement between the two had already began, my question was, well, does this mean that, okay, we see a first part of this agreement and then the rest fall apart? Is this what this is showing because of the cracked glass representing a crack in this agreement? And then again, when I saw the news about Hamas delaying the hostage release, this is what I thought about. On top of that, we hear that Netanyahu threatens to also end the ceasefire if Hamas failed to return the hostages. And so going back to the dream with Netanyahu with the blood on his head, when you hear the phrase, the blood is on their head, it means that someone is responsible for the death or the misfortune of another person. In this case, we're looking at the hostages. So Netanyahu is in a tough spot. He has to make a decision. If Hamas chooses not to hand over the hostages, then the ceasefire would come to an end, and those who are still held captive, there's no telling what would happen. And so families of loved ones will obviously look to the leader to say, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? Who knows? But at the end of the day, I see the fact that in that dream the blood was on his head. That could possibly represent this. The second thing is the dream about Palestine and the word war. In this dream, I saw the word war being written in this particular chart. And so understanding if the ceasefire agreement falls through, then again, we'll be back at war. The Palestinians was back at war again with Israel. And something that stuck out during this week in the news that I saw that went along with that dream as well. In this dream, I also knew something about a split. And so I saw this article talking about Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia vows no ties with Israel without creation of Palestine state. And so I don't know all of the details about how the state and split and all that works. But since having this dream, I have heard a little bit about it, have not did much research. And so, again, Trump gets online and he puts out his thoughts and opinions as far as Hamas and what they were doing. And Hamas quickly got in line, and we see that the hostage release went forth as planned. So looking back at everything over the course of this time frame, we see that so much has been said about small trade war between China and other places and tariffs and all this obviously involving the U.S. And then on the other side, the other war as it relates to Russia and Ukraine, a lot had been going on in the news as it relates to a peace deal with them, coming to a ceasefire, I'm not going to get into all that, but one of the things that was said by Zelensky. And he said that there were intelligence reports suggesting that Putin is preparing for war against NATO countries next year. And this news came out on February the 14th. There was also news that came out that was walked back. I'm not exactly sure if this was the day before, the 13th or 12th, but there was news that came out where seemingly J.D. Vance warned that the U.S. could use military actions in Ukraine if Russian President Putin does not agree to a peace deal. So people in their minds were thinking that, okay, the U.S. is trying to get involved directly with this war between Ukraine and Russia. And then he came back and he simply stated that this war is between Russia and Ukraine. He said that American troops should never be put into harm's way where it doesn't advance Americans' interests and security. And so I feel like he was trying to clear the air that this is not, his statement wasn't about the U.S. being directly involved in the war. But here again, focusing on what Zelensky had to say about Putin's plans to invade or go to war against NATO countries. That would directly involve us, because if one NATO country is attacked, then we're all attacked. And so for me, that was the big news as far as February 14th goes. And so it puts into question, is this the small physical war that we could possibly be involved in if Russia was to follow through with what President Zelensky is suggesting that he sees within his intel reports. Now, hearing this reminded me of a dream about Putin that I have not shared. I have been sitting on this dream for a while, and I feel that it's needed to share now. And this dream had to do with curtains, a fancy black dress, and October 7th. Before I share the dream really quickly, I told you guys that I felt like God was leading me to use this Hebrew calendar, and how he had been dealing with me with a lot as it relates to Israel and the war that's going on in Israel, or that was before the ceasefire. And one of the things that I learned about the Hebrew calendar was that it began on October 7th, the same day that the attack happened on Israel. However, this calendar, of course, began many, many years ago. Now getting to the dream. So this dream began with me talking on the phone with my mom. I was sitting at this table in this room, and our conversation was about all the Putin dreams that I had been having. And so I hung up the phone and I walked out the room, only to find that Putin was standing outside of this room door, and I wasn't sure how much of the conversation that he heard. I looked at him and he had this blank look on his face, like he just stood there and just looked at me. And so I couldn't figure out whether he was mad at me, had he heard enough to be mad at me. And so I asked him, if he was okay, but he didn't say anything. So I just walked off. And throughout the rest of this dream, I was basically looking over my shoulder because I wasn't sure if he was mad at me or not. And so, leaving him standing there, I looked up at these very, very tall ceilings. They could have been like 16, maybe 20 feet tall. And from ceiling to floor, I saw these curtains. And you pull one curtain back, and then there was another curtain. And then you pull that curtain back, and then there would be a room or some sort. So throughout this dream, I'm moving these curtains back, and not only am I moving these curtains back, I'm also looking over my shoulder because, again, I don't know if Putin's mad at me. And so the final part of this dream, I saw a small group of kids sitting on the floor, and behind them, there were 4 men who sat in these chairs, and I understood that these were members of the Kremlin group. And so a lady that used to work at the school where I used to work, she was the cook, and she would, of course, prepare the meals for the kids. And so in the dream, she was trying to prepare the meals, and what caused her to stand out was that she was wearing this fancy black dress. It had sparkles in it. It was kind of like a potato chip shaped dress, and she was extremely fancy to be, gathering food and putting food together for the kids. And so she asked me, are you busy? Can you help me get the kids food? And I told her, no, I can help. It's perfectly fine. And so we began to serve the kids food. And so this dream I had on November the 30th of last year. November 30th was the same day that the Syrian rebels swept through, and they began, I guess, their invasion of a certain portion of Israel, I think Lebanon. And I'll share my connections with that happening with Putin. So I woke up from this dream, and I'm wondering, why was Jeannie in this dream wearing this fancy dress serving food? And what was really going on behind the curtains in this dream involving Putin? Is it yet to be seen? So the first thing I did was I went to Facebook and I looked up Miss Jeannie to see when her birthday was. And to my surprise, her birthday was October the 7th, the same day that the Hebrew calendar started, the same day that Hamas attacked Israel, and it's also the same day as Putin's birthday. So I have two people in my dream who has the same exact birthday of October 7th. So God is showing me something about this October 7th date, but what? Why is he emphasizing this so strongly? Well, following both wars, the Israel and Hamas war and the Russia and Ukraine war, we see that Putin is involved to an extent, one more than the other, in both of these wars. He was giving help to Iran as they were using their proxy groups to attack Israel, and he's also fighting a war of his own. I shared that I had this dream about Putin and these curtains on November 30th. On November 30th is when the Syrian rebels swept through and they began to use sudden offensive movement to attack the government of President Assad. Now, God gave me a word about Lebanon in November, actually on my birthday in November, but I've never shared that and I'm not going to share it now. But just understand that this connects to what he was sharing with me. And so here we have, again, the 30th, this news came out, the 30th, my dream. And then we see that the government of President Assad fell on December the 8th. So the Syrian rebels came in and they just swept through everything. Well, when this happened, the president of the government that fell, he left Lebanon, or left that portion of Israel, and he went to Putin. Why? Because Putin and Iran were both involved with this president that had just fallen, this president who had just seen his government collapse by the hands of these Syrian rebels. And so this fall caused Putin to take a hit. This fall caused Iran to take a hit. And of course, Israel had something to say about it, which Israel, it didn't really bother them too much during this time. They even gave themselves credit for causing Iran to be weak during this time because, of course, the war had been going on between Israel and Iran. So by the time this group came in, this Syrian rebel group came in, Israel is saying that we had already weakened them to the point where it wasn't much of a leg to stand on. And so you guys came in and did what you had to do. And therefore, this government was toppled. And clearly, Putin is not happy about that. So this is the only connection that I have as it relates to October 7th and Israel as far as the October 17th date goes. Again, because Putin is playing both sides of this war. He's helping Iran on the Israel war side, and he's, of course, trying to help himself with his war with Ukraine. So what is it that Putin has going on behind the curtains, these curtains that I saw in my dream, and why is Putin connected to these October 7th date as it relates to the Hebrew calendar, the attack in Israel, and then, of course, this individual in my dream whose birthday was also October 7th, all of these October 7th dates. So my question back then when I had this dream was, could there be something later that's going to take place with Putin and Israel as it relates to Syria that ties his birthday, October 7th, to the attack on Israel, October 7th? Or is what Zelensky is saying here is true, and that this is what Putin has going on behind the curtains, or is it both? Is there going to be something going on behind the curtains as it relates to Israel and Syria and him coming back into Israel, trying to seek revenge on this Syrian rebel group? Or does he really have plans to attack these NATO countries, as stated by Zelensky? Or is it both? I guess we would have to wait and see. But in the meantime, again, the focus is on February 14th, hearing something major in the news. And this was, for me, major news as it related to the U.S. being directly involved, possibly being directly involved in a war, if this is what's actually planned. So that is all that I have for this video. Until the next one, God bless.